Mhm.
Welcome to all of you who are joining us today for this special discussion under the title of Alternative Futures for How the War Ends, What Happens in Russia, Ukraine's Trajectory Post-War, and How Cohesive is the West. We are now in the 111th day of the war. As we know, the war on the Eastern Front is very intensive. Even by President Zelensky's own admission, there are very heavy Ukrainian losses. Heavy weaponry definitely hasn't arrived at the Eastern Front at all. Analysts are speaking about war fatigue, saying that there may be a fissure already in the Western coalition, and it is unknown what will happen, for example, with negotiations. Macron, arriving in Romania, has very strongly suggested that negotiations is the only path. And he says that despite the fact that Putin already announced that, as Peter I did, he will reunite the empire, which of course means that Latvia and Estonia, certainly Moldavia, Romania, have every reason to be afraid. And negotiations do not seem, at least if he is to be stopped, as an alternative. These are some of the questions, these are some of the events that are very recent. These are some of the issues that our panelists will be looking at today, or our discussants. And let me briefly introduce them again. They are joining us for the second time. We hope to make this a monthly discussion session. They are Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl, Professor Motyl, is a political scientist, a historian, and he's chair of the political science department at the Ukrainian Free University. He is a professor of political science at Rutgers. He is an expert on Ukraine, Russia, Soviet Union, and as many of you may know, he focuses on empires, nationalism, and revolution. He has been a steady analyst of the war from the beginning, and his contributions and analysis can be found in such sites as EU Observer, Atlantic Council, The Hill, Politico. He's very much keeping his eye, and we are very much looking forward to hearing his insights today. Our second discussant is Professor Rajan Menon. He is a political science as well, chair of the political science department at the City University of New York. He's director of Grand Strategic Program at Defense Priorities and a senior research fellow at Saltzman Institute on War and Peace at Columbia University. Last time I cited some of his books, but I'd like to note today that he is preparing a book called What Will America Fight For? It is my great pleasure to turn the podium over to Professor Motyl and Professor Menon, and I wait to hear your interesting insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Prishlak, for putting this together. Unlike last time, Alex and I have decided that I would ask the first question and he would do more talking than I will, which is a good thing. So Alex, there's not a day that goes by when we don't exchange multiple texts trying to monitor the twists and turns of everything that's going on the battlefield, who's winning where and what it means and so on. But let me take you away from the battlefield and ask a question that I find coming up more and more, raised both by people who are critics of the American involvement in the war, but also by people who are very strong proponents of Ukraine. That is to say, are there signs that the Western coalition that's backing Ukraine is showing some signs of disunity? And I wanted to get your thoughts on this. First, do you see those signs? And second, how deep are they? And third, what does it mean?
I think it's one of these half full, half empty answers. When you consider where the West, and essentially we're talking about this collective West, of where the West was about 4 months ago, 5 months ago, before the invasion, before the war, one will have noticed that there was very little agreement about policy towards Ukraine. Or rather, let me put it this way, there was agreement in the sense that there wasn't much of a policy toward Ukraine. Ukraine wasn't on any country's special radar, a bit more for the US and the Brits, significantly less for everybody else. So from that point of view, from that vantage point, I think it's fair to say that the fissures were either great, in as much as there was very little proactive unity, pro-Ukrainian unity, or alternatively, there was a kind of monolithic indifference. And of course, I'm exaggerating when I say it's monolithic, but there was a general kind of indifference toward Ukraine. If you compare that with the condition today, then there's been a sea change. There's a meeting taking place in Ramstein. 50 countries have sent their ministers of defense. Most of them are European, but there are a certain number of countries in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa as well. And whatever their commitment or whatever their degree of commitment, 50 is a fairly impressive number. Even if they're only there for the food, it's still an impressive number. So compared to where we were 4 months ago, let's call it the collective West plus whomever else happens to be concerned, is exhibiting a remarkable degree of unanimity, a remarkable degree of determination and support for Ukraine. That said, obviously the coalition isn't monolithic, but of course it never was, if you think about it. There were always some countries that were more eager to help Ukraine. There were others that were less persuaded that the help needed to be brought to Ukraine immediately. And in a way, that really hasn't changed. I mean, the Germans and the French were troublemakers, so to speak, a month or two ago, or at least they were less enthusiastic than the Brits and the Americans, and they still are. They're more enthusiastic than they were 4 months ago, but they're not quite as enthusiastic as the Brits and the Americans. So I'm inclined to see, again, stasis isn't quite the right word, but I see continuity. It seems to me that within the last 3 months, there's been a remarkable degree of solidarity with Ukraine and a remarkable degree of continuity of solidarity. There's been a significant sea change from 4 months ago through until today. What will the future hold? Here's the big question. Roger, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay. What will the future hold? That's, of course, the question. On the one hand, one would expect these sorts of broad-based coalitions, regardless of what the goal of such a coalition is, to weaken over time. It's just in the nature of the beast. On the other hand, the situation is very fluid and very dynamic, and so much depends on what Ukraine, and especially Russia, does. If Ukraine is able to sustain the front, if it's able to acquire weapons and drive back the Russians, indeed, it looks like the Ukrainians have already launched something like a counteroffensive just to the north and west of Kherson. If they're able to establish control over some of these territories, even if they lose incrementally in the Donbass, that would create a strong incentive to solidify around the Ukrainian cause. Ultimately, what I would bank on is the virtually guaranteed stupidity of Vladimir Putin. Every time that it looks like the West is about to break up into a series of disputatious components that can't agree on much of anything, Putin comes along and does something outrageous, either an invasion or an atrocity or a genocide or something like that. And in that sense, I fully expect the Russians to supply the West with that needed glue. Every time there's a fissure, perhaps what happens is that the Kremlin regards this as an opportunity to strike back and to increase the fragmentation. But instead, what almost invariably happens is that it tends to reduce the fissures, reduce the fragmentation, and create a greater sense of solidarity.
So let me just make a few statements not necessarily my view, and ask you to react to them serially. One is that the degree of support that Ukraine has from so many countries in the West, NATO and non-NATO, is simultaneously a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because I don't think anybody expected this degree of unity in the face of what is Europe's biggest war since World War II. But it's a curse because, as you well know it from political science, the larger the number, the harder to manage the collective action problem and prevent countries from defecting. So that's the first observation I want you to respond to. The second is this: could one take the view that it doesn't matter very much whether there are calls by Macron for Ukraine to negotiate, or German Leopard tanks taking their time to come to Ukraine? As long as the United States is in the game foursquare, the rest of it is irrelevant, or if not irrelevant, then marginal, because the US is the one that's providing most of the weaponry, hands down. And then the final one, because I don't want to overload you with observations. In the early days, there was this huge enthusiasm for Ukraine. I mean, the heroism shown by the Ukrainian people was unlike anything we've seen, I think, in any war for a very long time. They were beating back the Russians from Kiev and Chernihiv and Kharkiv against all odds. There were discoveries of atrocities. The war was seen as a blatant act of aggression. And there was this relentless focus and this belief that the West was backing a very, very important and noble cause. With the passage of time, especially if the Russians are able to make headway, do you worry, especially because of the economic consequences of the war in the West, about something called Ukraine fatigue? And I asked this, and I'll finish with this last sentence. I was writing something today in which I cited you in another context, and I just Googled Ukraine fatigue. And lo and behold, it was not a term that was used very much. And all of a sudden it's popping up. In today's New York Times, Bret Stephens, who was a conservative and a very big supporter of Ukraine, kind of alludes to it without using the term. So if you wouldn't mind, just give me your thoughts on these things.
Great questions, thank you. I think, with regard to the first question you asked about this kind of broad support being a curse, because of course it entails the possibility of defections. Yes, but the bottom line is, of course, that of these 50 countries, let's assume that they're all more or less committed in some way to Ukraine's sovereignty, as you implied, and as you actually said in your second question, it's really a question of whether there's a core that maintains this commitment. And that's the answer to the first question. It's also the answer to the second question. I mean, the US is at the core. One could say that it's the US, the UK, possibly Australia, New Zealand, maybe add another one or two countries. But the bottom line is that it is, of course, about the United States.
Yeah, but just to interrupt very briefly, I just wanted you to clarify this. You speak of a core, but in that core, do you include Germany, France, and Italy? Are they part of the core? Because they are the ones who are wavering.
Yeah, I'd like to, but they're the waverers, but they've been kind of wavering all the time. So I put them somewhere in between wavering and not wavering, but they're not quite in the core. They should be, they could be, they might be, but at this point in time, they're not. But as you said, the vast majority of the weapons that are being delivered, the greatest outlays of financial support are coming from the United States. So one could argue, and I think, well, one does argue that as long as the US retains its commitment to Ukraine, all is more or less well. And the US can always use its clout or its soft power or powers of persuasion to persuade some of the doubters to mobilize and support as well. So that's the answer to the first two questions. Namely, I think it's a question of the US And at that point, of course, once one says it's the question primarily of the US, the third question becomes extremely important because, Ukraine fatigue in Slovakia, well, that might make a bit of a difference since the Slovaks have been providing some weaponry, but ultimately it's not quite the same thing as Ukraine fatigue in the UK, and most importantly, Ukraine fatigue in the United States. So to the degree that there is such a thing as Ukraine fatigue, and I think you're right, there is a sense that the battle, that the war has become, it's a daily grind, it's not dramatic, it's a war of position. There are no major atrocities, thank God, but at the same time, there are no major headlines that one encounters, right? So all these things play some kind of role in creating a sense of normalcy regarding a very abnormal and very tragic situation. And then, of course, there are all sorts of other things that come into play, mass shootings, economic conditions, the approaching American elections. And whereas initially Ukraine was, occupied the entire first page of newspapers, now it might be a column somewhere to the left, it might be page 2 news and things of that sort. I think it's going, so that's obviously a concern, but there are a number of issues that argue against Ukraine fatigue adopting full force, if you like. One is this notion of sunk costs. I mean, the United States, and again, we're talking primarily about the Americans, the US has invested enormously in Ukraine. It's obviously, we're talking about money, we're talking about weaponry, we're talking about political capital in as much as it's mobilized many of its allies to support Ukraine. And these costs, these are sunk costs. To turn 180 degrees away from this would be very, very difficult, if only for a variety of institutional reasons. As you know, institutions have a tendency to reproduce themselves. Policies have a tendency to reproduce themselves unless there's something that happens and, an intervening variable of some kind that gets in the way. So I think there's a kind of inbuilt momentum, given the vastness of support, that'll make it hard for any American administration, but especially Biden, to say, okay, this is enough, no more. Two, it obviously, things depend on conditions on the ground in Ukraine. For the time being, things have become, things are at a stalemate. The Russians are making some incremental progress here and some incremental losses there. So are the Ukrainians. It's a war of position. It's a war of artilleries. No major breakthroughs, no major news items, no sinking of boats, no mass breakthrough, no mass offensives or anything like that. If that continues indefinitely, months, not just months, perhaps even for a year or two, then I think the Ukraine fatigue will obviously intensify. It's my expectation, however, and it's not just, actually, it's not my expectation, it's the expectation of military analysts who know these things far better than I do, that Ukraine is likely to launch a major counteroffensive within about a month or two. That'll be dramatic. Whatever happens, whether the Ukrainians break through or not, my guess is they will, but who knows? That'll be, again, that will be dramatic. That will attract journalists and will attract the headlines. And it should counteract some of this growing fatigue. So ultimately, and final point, the one that might be even the most important one. If this were simply a war where you had two armies fighting, it would be easier to say, well, it's a war, it's far away, we're tired, things aren't moving, let's just forget this. But thanks to Putin, or thanks to Russia perhaps, the Russian troops have committed crimes against humanity, war crimes, and as a number of respectable institutions and scholars have suggested, I'm not counting myself in this, Russia seems to have committed genocide. That changes things. Perhaps not in a very direct fashion, but it certainly changes things discursively. It's once you've gone and admitted that the Russians are engaging in these kinds of major atrocities, systemic atrocities, rapes, killings of civilians, it just becomes harder to say, well, it doesn't matter. So I think those three factors are going to militate against this fatigue. They may not transform it into vigor and enthusiasm, but I think they represent barriers to its growth in any kind of a significant fashion. Let me ask you a question now, if I may. I think, you know, you and I are in agreement that Russia / Putin has to lose. What does that mean? What does it mean for Russia to lose? And how do we get there? And by we, I guess I mean both the Ukrainians and then, you know, the collective West or the collective supporters of Ukraine.
But before I begin, let me just apologize to you and the audience. If you see me coughing every once in a while, I'm in New Hampshire in a village in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a forest, and I'm allergic to every single tree in that forest, and I have terrible allergies. So please bear with me. I do think this war of aggression should be stopped. And as you know, I have been a very fierce critic of NATO expansion, but I think that there was nothing on February 23rd that suggested that Ukraine posed a mortal threat to Russia. For it to invade one of the largest countries in Europe and try to overthrow its government on the preposterous charge that it was dominated by Nazis. So this is clearly normatively, legally, a unjust war by Russia, which is one of the reasons why you've had so many people come here. The problem is, and de Gaulle pointed this out, the French president de Gaulle, in one of his books. He said, one of the things I've learned from war is that all the virtue in the world melts away and doesn't stand up to enormous firepower. So I think it's critical for Ukraine, in order to maintain support here in our country, in the United States and in Europe, to show continued battlefield success. It's not a huge success, but they're continuing to press on. Nobody doubts their morale. The question is, do they have the capacity to press on? For that, of course, they need weaponry, and President Zelensky and Mr. Podolyak and Mr. Reznikov and others have been urgently now calling for weaponry. One of the things that I see that worries me, and I'll come to your what does it mean to win question in a second. We talked about this the other day. So in this pocket in the Donbass, composed of Bakhmut, Popasna, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, it's clear what the Russians are doing. They're trying to encircle a good part of Ukraine's special forces operation. Now, these happen to be some of Ukraine's most battle-tested, experienced, and well-trained troops. And while I'm not trying to second-guess the Ukrainian general staff, because I'm not a general, I find, on the one hand, the claim that up to 200 people are being lost every day, soldiers. And on the other hand, the unwillingness to make a tactical retreat to be surprising, because it seems to me at some point the sheer volume of Russian numbers and firepower is going to do its magic. You know, it's been about 50,000 artillery firings a day that Ukraine has absorbed in this sector versus about 5,000 for Russia. So I think one has to decide where one wants to fight one's battles, and one can't lose many of one's best trained troops, because yes, you can bring people from the reserves, but throwing some 18-year-old kid into the battlefield suddenly and trying to think that he'll replace a very well-trained soldier strikes me as a puzzling proposition. What does it mean to win? From what I can tell from President Zelensky, and I don't plan to speak for him here, obviously, one way to look at it is that you have to, at minimum, return to the pre-February 24 lines, which means that the Russians have to evacuate 90% of Lugansk, which is what they control more or less, and about 50% of Donetsk. And then they have to withdraw from Kherson and from Zaporozhye. They have about 60% of that. And then they've got to give up the strip of land, the so-called land corridor that they have on the shores of the Sea of Azov. Without that, I don't know what there would be to negotiate about. I mean, one of the things about negotiations that mystifies me now is Ukraine is not holding a very strong hand because its large parts of its territory are under occupation. So it seems to me negotiation leading to some kind of victory would at minimum require that. And so that's how I would answer the question. Now, whether that's likely to happen soon, I don't know. My own sense is that we're not anywhere near the end of the war. And that's not good news for Ukraine unless it receives on a regular basis continued weaponry. And it's already asking for more. Now, I was at a conference recently where a very, very senior American officer said two things that I think Ukrainians need to be cognizant of. The first thing he said was, at some point, if we continue to support Ukraine, and he was, by the way, an advocate of supporting Ukraine, I want to make this clear. He said the Russians are going to treat the United States as a co-belligerent. That is to conclude that the United States is a war with Russia. The second thing he said was, we had better hope that Russia is really weakened by this war because we are depleting our own stocks of weaponry because we're sending so much of it there, and there's no sign that we'll send less. So in some sense, Ukraine needs battlefield victories, continued flows of arms. Morale is not a problem. So I would say if you return to the February 24 lines, that would constitute a victory, it seems to me. Not a complete victory, but a victory nonetheless.
Even Henry Kissinger in his latest interview said that. Of course, that begs the question of how. And presumably the Russians aren't going to withdraw on their own voluntarily, so that means they'd have to be pushed out, which of course presupposes some kind of continued Western assistance. Although, interestingly enough, this is the one thing that puzzles me a bit. In the last week or so, Ukraine seems to have launched, again, I'm not sure if the correct term is counteroffensive or a counteroffensive operation in the Kherson area. And just yesterday or the day before, they apparently were the Ukrainian armed forces were about 10 kilometers away from the city itself. Now, if all this is true, and the military analysts that I've been listening to suggest that it is, both the American ones and the Western ones and the Ukrainian ones, then that would seem to suggest that Ukraine is actually capable of launching, if not full-scale counteroffensives, then at least localized counteroffensives that might indeed prove to be successful. And of course, if they manage to recapture Kherson, and then even more so drive the Russians out of Kherson Oblast, that would be a strategic win of enormous proportions.
So here's my sense. The Ukrainians have absolutely shown that they're capable of launching a counteroffensive. That is how the Russians were driven out of the north and prevented from taking Kiev, and prevented from taking Kharkiv, and prevented from taking Sumy. The difference in Kherson, and I'm not prejudging the outcome, I have no way of knowing what will happen there. The difference is, this is now a territory that the Russians control So you're launching an operation and trying to expel a force where it already exists and in some sense is dug in. Something of a challenge. There are two views on this from military experts that I've talked to, some of whom are people with combat experience. One is that the Ukrainians will react to something like the reverses temporarily in Donbass by doing exactly this, by launching an Operation Kherson, and that's exactly the smart thing to do. The other is, well, it remains to be seen whether this operation, as it moves forward, can be sustained. Can they continue supplying forces? Can they continue taking and holding land? And so, nobody really knows. But I agree with you. If they were to take Kherson, I mean, that would be a very, very big, that would change things dramatically. Let me put a proposition before you. And I have no idea whether this is going to happen because President Putin doesn't confide in me, certainly. But let's assume, for just the sake of argument, that they're able to lock up the Donbass, that is, to take the 10% or so of Lugansk that they don't have yet, and then move on to take Donetsk, which would, and then make some headway in, say, Zaporozhye. And then Putin declares a ceasefire. He says the special operation is over, and he turns to the Russian people and says, I've restored substantial lands. He might invoke the Novorossiya project. And he tells his generals to dig in and defend it, the territories they hold, and then it's up to Ukraine to push the Russians out of these territories. Now, counteroffensives, right, can be handled with surface-to-air missiles, counter-battery radar, anti-tank missiles. But to push an adversary out of areas that it occupies, you need tanks, airplanes, armored vehicles of various sorts, and it's going to be a much harder thing to do. Now, why would Putin do this? It seems to me that, if I were his military advisor, I would say, if you have intentions of taking control of a country of 44 million people that's not happy to have your troops on its homeland, I think you will end up in a terrible disaster because the Russian army has shown itself to have all kinds of problems. So, Mr. President, why don't you do this? We'd have the added advantage of really throwing the Western alliance into a kind of, well, what do we do now? I mean, this is the basis for negotiation and so on. Any reactions to this admittedly hypothetical scenario?
Oh, I think it's a great scenario, certainly something to consider. I remember, you may recall, before the war broke out, we talked about a number of scenarios for the occupied Donbass regions. And one of these scenarios that we both kicked around was Putin's leaving the DNR and the LNR and just giving this mess to the Ukrainians, who would then have to deal with the armed forces and the collapsing economy and a hostile population. And rationally, that seemed like a wonderful way of weakening Ukraine, essentially stopping any reform efforts, moving it away from the West and towards the East. And it was in some ways almost a no-lose proposition, except for the fact that it would never have occurred to Putin to do this because he's placed so much of his prestige and legitimacy on being the ingatherer of Russian lands. And I think that's really the obstacle here as well. Yes, going in and simply saying we've recaptured the Donbass, which is what we wanted to do all the time, would be a rational way of getting out of this mess. But when you consider, and of course, it would have been the thing to do back on February 22nd.
Right. But it's more than the Donbass, right? It's more than the Donbass. He's also got part of the Black Sea coast, not Odessa, right, but part of the Black Sea coast. He's got the land corridor. He's got part of Zaporozhye. So that's pretty.
I mean, it's more than that. I mean,
yeah.
So he could claim that
substantial win, right?
Right. I mean, a certain kind of win. Except that, remember, it's again, I think a rational leader, a well, maybe I shouldn't use that word because it immediately raises questions, but so let's call him a normal leader. Someone who isn't obsessed with Ukraine, who doesn't compare himself with Peter the Great, who doesn't think of himself as an ingatherer of Russian lands. I think it would be significantly easier for a run-of-the-mill tyrant to accept this kind of deal, trumpet it as a victory, persuade the population that 40, 50, 60,000 dead was worth it, and so on. I do think that there is an obstacle within his own head. Increasingly, I see, at least rhetorically, one finds a radicalization of the rhetoric amongst the Russian elite. The prime example of this being Dmitry Medvedev, who used to be a regular kind of guy 10 years ago, and now he's turned into this sort of like the equivalent of a mini Hitler. I mean, his radicalism even exceeds that of Putin. He's kind
Did
of
you hear what he said today, by the way?
Yes. 2 years from now, there may be no Ukraine. And of course, the Ukrainians responded, well, the real question is, where will Medvedev be 2 years from now? So they haven't lost their sense of humor. But it seems to me that, again, were we dealing with a run-of-the-mill tyrant, I'd say these scenarios would be something to consider. And of course, they might still be something to consider. But since we're dealing with Putin and his entourage, and the kind of radical, extremist, imperialist, anti-Ukrainian, just about genocidal rhetoric and policies, it seems that it would be very hard for them to abandon that and say, oh, well, this was really all about a bunch of real estate in the southeast of Ukraine after all. Now, again, it's not impossible, but it would certainly be very hard. The other point you raise implicitly is that Russia could occupy these territories. Well, it has occupied these territories, and it would have the wherewithal, the capacity, militarily and otherwise, to sustain these occupations. And that's something I thought we should talk about as well, because here we'd be talking about the capacity of the Ukrainians to maintain an offensive. Do they have enough weapons? Do they have enough soldiers? Are they strong enough? Are they too weak? And so on. But of course, the very same questions are raised and have to be raised about Russia. And at least based on what I've been reading, I mean, the consensus amongst analysts seems to be that Russia has also reached the limits of its mobilization. I mean, they are now at the point where they don't seem to have enough quality soldiers. If they mobilize, that may lead to all sorts of difficulties. They're running out of quality modernized tanks. They're bringing into the war a variety of tanks that are 50, 60 years old. Their missiles seem to be on the verge of being depleted. Of course, the military strategy simply seems to consist of sending in wave after wave of cannon fodder, forgive the mixed metaphor, along with obliterating the cities that they ostensibly claim to be liberating. One could argue that their capacity to resist a Ukrainian assault is no greater than the Ukrainian capacity to launch an assault, which, worst case scenario would mean a continuation of a stalemate. But if indeed they can't resist as much as they think they can, and the Ukrainians acquire additional weaponry and don't make any strategic mistakes in the process, then that would seem to suggest that Ukraine has a pretty good chance of actually pushing the Russians out of these territories that they control, at least so far. And then final point, we've been following the guerrilla movements, the partisan movements in the South and the Southeast. Some of that's been instigated by Ukrainian special forces, but a lot of that seems to be local talent, in some ways or others mobilized by special forces and taking the initiative. Increasingly, I've been hearing Ukrainian analysts saying that this guerrilla movement is only going to intensify. And if and when the full-scale offensive, counteroffensive begins, they will do their best to undermine, to destroy Russian depots, ammunition dumps, affect the infrastructure. That could be significant. I mean, again, or not, but in any case, it's already present, and it's certainly something that we should be watching for.
The insurgency is very interesting because it has taken on something of a life, not to be unexpected. I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and I said, well, no, what do you think about it? And he said, well, have you watched the series on Netflix, I think it is, called A French Village? I have not, but it's about the occupation of France during World War II. And of course, there was a resistance. But the Germans largely succeeded in destroying it because there were no limits to which they would not go. In other words, it didn't matter how many civilians were killed, didn't matter what techniques were used, they were very, very brutal. Insurgency could work, could not work. I'm going to come back to something else, and that's the atrocities, right? One of the things that created moral fervor on Ukraine's side in the West was the discovery of atrocities in places like Bucha in particular, but not just there, everywhere. I have mixed feelings about how much people are willing to be moved by this over the long haul. Remember in Rwanda, close to 1 million people were killed in less than 3 months, and nobody really did very much of anything. It was the Rwandan Patriotic Front that put an end to it. And then you had Bosnia. Something was done there, but it took 3 years. And so the atrocity and the genocide allegation, these are powerful things, and I think stir people's emotion. My concern about American steadfastness is this. I think there's a principal commitment to back Ukraine. But President Biden now has a 39% approval rating. The war hasn't done him very much good, and I think, well, there's support for the war and interest in the war in the foreign policy communities, in the run-of-the-mill American town or village such as the one I'm inhabiting, it's as if it doesn't even exist. So we have an inflation rate of 8.1%, highest in 40 years. Economic growth rates have been revised downward by the Congressional Budget Office. It's 3% this year. They expect to be 2.2% next year, 1.1% the following year. Now, let's concede that economic forecasts are just that. They're forecasts. Then there could be significant unemployment. And we have the midterm elections coming. And I expect the Democrats to lose and a fair number of Trump people to be in the new Congress. It is also conceivable that in 2024, and we must hope the war is not being waged then, that Trump himself will be elected. I'm sorry, I muted myself prematurely. Are you worried about these trends in the United States, or likely trends?
Well, these are all serious issues, of course. And again, it goes back to the point we made about the critical role that the United States has played in supporting the effort. If the United States loses its interest, or if a new administration loses its interest, that would be a very severe blow to Ukraine's chances. Clearly, I mean, regardless of everything I said, but clearly that would make an enormous difference. What I'm still impressed by is the continued, again, it's not fervor anymore. Initially, there was a fervor in the United States, and people were saying things, oh, we are all Ukrainians and so on. Well, obviously, you can't just, it's impossible to sustain that. And it hasn't been sustained. And at the same time, neither has it fully dissipated. I was at the Metropolitan Opera a few days ago, and the director, whomever came out at the very beginning and was talking about the last performance and so on. And he ended his presentation, it was only 5 minutes, he ended his talk by saying, and we support the freedom of Ukraine. That unleashed wild applause. And again, this was a performance of Rigoletto, so I'm pretty sure that these weren't Ukrainians, Americans applauding. So there's still that, it still means something, it still resonates. I was in a small town called Cold Spring yesterday, located on the shores of the Hudson River. It's one of these quintessentially cute 19th century towns. And I think I saw about 10 Ukrainian flags. hanging from balconies and windows. And again, I'm pretty sure there's not much of a Ukrainian contingent living in the town. Now, of course, for the 10 flags that I saw, I didn't see thousands of others, obviously, right? So we're not talking about a mass movement, but there's still some kind of residual belief that this matters a great deal. Now, will it sustain itself? Well, obviously it depends. I'm inclined to think that the Ukrainians will be in the position to launch a counteroffensive, and that it's likely to be more or less successful. And again, notice I'm hedging my bets here. I think
in the Donbass or somewhere else?
Well, along the entire front. Now, where will it be fully successful, partially successful, unsuccessful? I'm in no position to say that, but it seems to me that about 1 or 2 months from now, they're likely to do that. I think that will regenerate more of this vigor and enthusiasm. It will make the case for supporting Ukraine more urgent. At the same time, I would want to emphasize that, you know, the degree to which Americans support or not support a foreign policy adventure launched by Washington isn't exactly critical to whether or not Washington decides to pursue that or not. You know, it matters on the margins, and it may matter over time, but not immediately. I mean, generally, presidents and governments can pretty much push through just whatever they want, regardless of the protests taking place on the streets or the supporters protesting on the streets. So I'm not sure how much importance I'd give to popular support. Where I think what's more important, and that's your other comment addressed that directly, is the degree to which the political elites, both the analyst types like you and me, but more importantly, people in the various institutions, the degree to which they continue to think of this as an important foreign policy issue. And you're right. I mean, if the Republicans win and if they see this as an opportunity to increase their vote, they might decide to turn against the Ukrainians or not. Again, or not. I mean, there's always that possibility, given what I had said before, that there is a certain kind of momentum and a certain kind of inertia, rather, that this has acquired, and that it would take a great deal of counterforce to prevent this object from continuing to move in a certain direction. But it's possible. And you mentioned the congressional elections, and of course, there's also the possibility that Trump will be returned. And then, but as you said, that would be 2 years from now. And if the war is still going on 2 years from now, then heaven help us all.
Right. So a couple of things that worry me. I think you're right that the President Biden's freedom to continue arming Ukraine will not be affected by public opinion. I don't think the public is going to object to that. What I can see is if Ukraine's economic needs grow substantially, and you know that by Ukraine's own assessment, it needs $5 billion a month to balance its budget. And to go back to my scenario, if you have Putin tell his commanders not to go any further, to dig in and defend the areas they hold, and respond to Ukrainian counteroffensives by just destroying as much of the country as possible, then there comes the question of how do you make Ukraine whole again? Now, assume that the US goes into a recession in Europe. I don't know whether it will, but I do know that serious economists are talking about the possibility. Then you could have a situation where the debate begins, especially with the Ukrainian Congress, about how much money can we send to Ukraine. On the military front, let me say this. I'm a little bit more pessimistic than you are, without in any way pretending to know how this will turn out. I have no idea. What I see going on in the Donbass is a Russian military machine that is huge, that is prepared to use enormous destruction without regard to civilian casualties to level entire cities if it needs to. So large parts of Severodonetsk are destroyed. Kharkiv is not taken, but suffered major destruction. Mariupol is essentially flattened, more or less. It's terrible. And then they have a lot of firepower to bring on board. You mentioned the tanks. Yes, they're sending outdated tanks, but their inventory of T-72s and T-80s and so on is still fairly substantial. Why they're sending these tanks out, I don't know. One theory is that it's easier to train people to operate them. I just don't know. If the pocket in Donbass is closed, and I don't see any way that the Ukrainians can hold Severodonetsk, it's going to be, I think, very, very difficult. Then you have Kramatorsk at risk from Izium, from the north, and from the east, from the consolidated pocket. The loss of Kramatorsk would be a very, very significant development. Now, how is it significant? Not because there's that much territory that's been taken, but the narrative of the heroic Ukrainians moving from one victory to the other and pushing Russia back, the sense that the United States is backing not only the righteous side, but the side that's winning, that narrative could begin to come unstuck. It doesn't mean that the US will stop fighting Ukraine, but I can see a change in the discussions and debate, and I begin to see it already. Where that will lead, I have no idea, which is why when we've texted back and forth, I've been focusing on this operation in Donbass and wondering whether we are at a turning point where, as Stalin once put it, at some point quantity creates its own quality. So if the Russians, on the one hand, did foolish things in the beginning, like trying to take Kiev and saying that they would control all of Ukraine and denazify it and so on, have they adapted and have they become much more selective? And are they going to be like this gigantic, rumbling, inefficient machine that nonetheless is so large that grinds down anything that's in its way? So that's what worries me. Now, we will know in the next couple of weeks whether that's something to in fact be worried about. But if it happens, then the West has to make a decision, right? How do you respond to this? Do you scale up military equipment? There are some people who have raised the question, well, if the Russians go from one success to the other, is there a risk in supplying pretty advanced weaponry to Ukraine that could end up in the wrong hands, that is to say, Russian hands? So when I look at pessimistic scenarios, and I'm by nature inclined to do that because of the quick look at the world, these are the things that give me pause.
I mean, the points you make are all very valid, of course, and we can't possibly exclude those. What strikes me, for what it's worth, again, when we converse about Severodonetsk, I read the Ukrainian websites, I look at the analysts, I listen to the analysts, about 3, 4, sometimes even 5 of them. There's no sense of impending doom. Now, that may be because they're just hiding their fears from the public. Although at the same time, I think it's pretty clear to me that the analysts I've been listening to are trying to be objective and aren't seeing through, are trying to avoid looking at things through rose-colored glasses. Again, it might be part of some larger scheme.
You mean people like Podolyaka and Zhdanov and others?
Zhdanov especially. Podolyaka is just he's a flunky, so I'm not sure how much I can trust him, but there's Zhdanov, there's a guy by the name of Petro Charnik, there's a guy by the name of Skalsky, Butusov, and a couple of others. And what strikes me is the degree to which they are all pretty much in agreement, including a couple of Westerners as well, pretty much in agreement that the situation, although serious, is not quite yet hopeless. Now, again, I'm not a military analyst, so I'm in no position to say, you got this right, you got that wrong. but I am struck by the degree to which they share this kind of consensus. Now, that said, as you rightly put it, we'll see what happens in the next 2 to 3 weeks. I mean, if the Russians manage to encircle the Ukrainian troops, that would be big. That would be very, very big. If the Ukrainians withdraw tactically, and they say that the communications between Lysychansk and Severodonetsk have not been cut off, even though those 3 bridges have been destroyed. That seems to imply, at least to me, that a withdrawal from Severodonetsk to Lysychansk would be possible and may indeed be forthcoming. Obviously, we'll see.
Lysychansk, by the way, is on elevated ground.
On elevated ground, and it's protected by a river, so has a certain kind of fortress-like status. Of course, the Russians would probably decide to destroy it block by block.
Well, they've already destroyed parts of it.
They've already destroyed parts of it, exactly. So its fate.
So listen, we've got 4 minutes, and you know, Maria, Professor Prislak is watching the time, not me. But I wanna just ask you. You've written quite often about how you think that this war could bring down not just Putin, but perhaps even the Russian state. Are you still sticking by that assessment?
Oh yes, yes, absolutely. You know what? I get encouraged by the fact that I'm seeing more and more analysts, Russians, Ukrainians, obviously, that goes without saying, but Russians as well as Westerners treating this as a serious possibility. 3, 4, 5 months ago, it was basically pie in the sky fantasizing or hypothesizing by people like me. But now it's actually treated as a very, very serious possibility, if not indeed a likelihood. I was listening recently to Igor Girkin, you know, the war criminal from the Donbass. He was being interviewed by some guy, and both of them agreed that if Putin goes, and these are essentially the exact words, that's the end of Russia, the konец России. And by that, they didn't mean the end of the regime. They actually meant the end of the Russian Federation. The whole place would just explode or implode, depending on where you stand. So I think this is becoming, again, in as much as this is becoming a not exactly conventional wisdom, but certainly is being treated seriously. It's something that we need to be looking at, and it's something we need to be thinking about. Now, what's the probability? I don't know, but I could easily spin a story, if you like, a narrative, which would be plausible at each step of the way, and which would conclude with the place, Russia, namely, breaking up into all sorts of bits and pieces, possibly engaged in civil war, possibly declaring independence, secession, what have you.
Right.
And a lot would obviously depend on the war. I think ultimately the key to any of this would be Putin. If he stays, this is unlikely. If he goes, in whichever fashion, this becomes increasingly more likely. And it obviously depends on the kind of power struggle that would result if and when he goes. Right. So if you assume he goes, and if you assume there's a power struggle, I can spin a fairly persuasive narrative. If he stays, then all bets are off.
Right. Professor Prislak, can we go over by just 2 minutes? Because I just want to respond to what Alex said. So here's why I think this is unlikely to happen. Conceding that you may be right. I don't, you know, I'm not a fortune teller.
Neither of us knows, yeah.
So the idea that Putin goes and the state collapses is possible, given the degree of power he wields. But we've seen very personalized states manage this before. So in no particular order, the fall of Niyazov in Turkmenistan, the fall of Karimov in Uzbekistan, the death of Kim Il-sung, or the death of Karimov, the death of Kim Il-sung in North Korea, the departure by death of Fidel Castro in Cuba. So it's not a foregone conclusion that Putin goes and somebody there's chaos, right? Could be somebody from the ranks. Now, if it's Medvedev, I don't think it will be. I mean, he clearly is not in any mood to compromise, unless Russia is in retreat and is in trouble. Then it's a different scenario. Protests. In the beginning, there were some, but I don't see any evidence of anything happening on the ground that the Russians can't manage. And I suspect, and this is perhaps the most controversial thing I'm going to say, that we in the West, in the United States, haven't been willing to face a basic fact that for whatever complicated set of reasons, there may be much more support among Russians for the war than we would like to think. Why? Because when a country is at war, you rally around the flag, and that rallying around the flag lasts for quite a long time until there's a military disaster, which hasn't happened yet. Because every time the Russians have taken a town, correct me if I'm wrong, they've never given it up. They've always, managed to hold on to it. So I think that Putin will last. Now, as for his illnesses, I have a former student, a Ukrainian, you know him, I'm not going to mention his name, but he's very involved in Ukrainian affairs and I think knows people at senior levels. He texted me the other day and said, I have now confirmation from authoritative sources in Russia that Putin is seriously ill. And I said, I just don't pay attention to these rumors because maybe he's ill, maybe he's not ill, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that he dies tomorrow or whatever. And then something dramatic changes, whereas we expect it to change. I mean, that's my 2 cents. Should we leave it there? I mean, I guess we're managing the show here.
Yeah, I think that's an appropriate place to leave it and an appropriate place to start our next conversation. We've been talking a lot about...
Do you want to say something at the end? Maybe you do, maybe you don't.
Well, I think we shall just wrap it up today, but I thank both of you for this discussion. I think I'll just say to be continued because there's so many questions to be raised yet and so many issues to be discussed. So I thank you both. And until next month, and we'll be sending out notifications, what date and what time. So thank you very much. Certainly food for thought, some pessimism, some optimism, but in sum total, very, very good. So thank you very much, both of you.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Alex.
Take care.
Till next time.
Goodbye then. Take care.